So over here in this part, this is, South America comes down into this area right about here. That's where South America is. This line is the Greenwich meridian. So it goes to Greenwich, England, north-south. And over here you would have Africa, over here Australia and New Zealand. Okay, so like Hawaii would be over here. We're like over here somewhere. Let's see, the landform of Antarctica. What part is land? So this whole thing is the continent of Antarctica. It's bigger than the United States. So it's very, very different from the Arctic, as I was saying earlier. It's the gray parts here are the landform is not totally known under that. There's a lot of glaciers sitting on top of the land. So there's some maps that are kind of a little bit fuzzy under there. So we don't know exactly where the land is there or here, but for the most part, that lighter gray stuff is the continent of Antarctica. I have one more question to answer, and then I'll come to you. And the last question that I remember, but we'll have time to discuss after, was why don't we build walls in front of our tents and our hut to protect against the wind, which does generally blow from the south? And the answer is the tents and the hut are actually in the lee of a perfectly good natural feature. The wind is that strong even with that. And when you do build a wall closer, which we have done, it actually makes things worse because it makes it more turbulent. So we get this rapid spinning of the wind that tears things apart. So it's better to let the wind just sweep through. And in fact, I've considered moving the entire camp out into the open so that it just gets a straight shot, because we are in the lee of a little bit of it's a very nice natural feature that's protecting us from lighter wind, but when it gets cranking, it creates this waveform that goes over the top of it and starts pounding the tents from above. So it's tricky. And when it's really windy like that, there is nowhere you can go out of the wind. It's windy in every direction. It's like a hurricane, basically, or a tornado. Okay, you got a question?
I remember reading a few years ago that there was a volcano underneath Antarctica, and I don't know where it is. There's a few volcanoes. On Ross Island, where we work, there's an active volcano called Mount Erebus, which is very, very visible. It's not buried. It's 12,000 feet tall. And smoking, and you can see it from everywhere, and a lot of people study it. Actually, it's one of the most studied volcanoes on Earth. There are thought to be under ice volcanoes as well, but they're not, as far as I don't know where they're mapped, how well mapped they are. Okay, so we've been studying the Adelies for since 1996 straight through, but also they're basically doing some of the same studies that people did starting in 1960, and in fact. There were people counting these penguin colonies during what's called the heroic era of exploration down there in the early 1900s. So some of these penguin colonies have been observed for a very long time. And this is one of my colleagues, Dr. Annie Schmidt, making observations of how many chicks are being raised per pair of penguins. And through this time period, the penguin colonies have been growing, actually, and really rapidly as of about the year 2000. This is all on a log scale, so you don't have the actual numbers. And most of these colonies, these are the three that we study most carefully. Actually, all four of these we do have good numbers on. And Cape Crozier, where I work, is this biggest one, and it has doubled in size since 2000. It was 150,000 pairs, and somehow it managed to go to 300,000 pairs. And when we studied it when we started studying it in '96, it was growing, and we said, well, let's calculate what we think the maximum size of a penguin colony could be. And we calculated that to be about 150 to 170,000 pairs, based on how much energy is required to feed that many penguins, and how much food seems to be available in the ocean within the foraging range of these penguins. So we were wrong. Somehow, we were really wrong. And in fact, not only are there more penguins than ever, by a long way, exceeding that limit, but the chicks in the most recent year that we studied last year, they had the most successful year ever. So while there's twice as many penguins, they're still raising more penguins than ever. So this trend is increasing. So we have a mystery on our hands, which is really fun. And we think it has something to do with climate change, but there's some complications. And remember what I was telling you about Aldo Leopold and the base datum of normality and having all the parts intact. Well, unfortunately, there's this fishery, and I started mentioning that with that toothfish, the really big fish that man was holding, that's been studied for their antifreeze properties. Well, in about 1997, those fish started getting targeted as basically the last intact fishery on the planet, where you could still go catch big fish pretty easily. You just have to be brave enough to deal with those storms and all that ice. And so people are doing that. Several countries are doing it. And this fishery is not a large fishery by any standard globally. Although when you look at it from an ecological perspective, it is big. The removal rate is about 3,000 metric tons per year. That's a lot of fish when you think about it in terms of competition for a penguin. Now, they do eat the same things as the penguins do. So we're wondering if maybe the reason that there's so many penguins now is because there's fewer and fewer competing large fish. And so we went to the people who study the big fish and we said, and to the toothfish and said, can we analyze your data in a way that you haven't done before? And we collaborated with them to look at the numbers of fish they were catching. They never really looked at how many fish they were catching because that's not what they were studying. They were studying the physiological properties of the fish. But we said, we want to know how many fish you're catching. And they had written it all down. They standardized it, how many hours of effort they made, how many hooks they set, and how many fish they caught. And it turns out that right around when that fishery started, they started catching way fewer of these large fish. And these fish, they were tagging and releasing. They weren't killing these fish. So the scientists weren't killing the fish. The fishery was definitely killing the fish and was selling it as Chilean sea bass. So we think, I mean, there's a few things that are pointing in this direction that this fishery might be having an effect on the ecosystem. The other thing we noticed was that those special killer whales are starting to get harder to see. There's fewer and fewer of them, and we know that they eat the toothfish as well. So there's a pretty significant trend up until about 2010. After 2012 or so, it's actually kind of flattened out. It didn't come back, but it's kind of flattened out. So I'm not sure what's going on with that. It may be that the killer whales have figured out how to eat something else. They're very smart. Or that the killer whales that were more dependent on the toothfish left and went somewhere else. We don't know. But there was that drop-off. So here you have this classic kind of food web study. It's really easy to do food web studies in Antarctica compared to other places because there's so few players in the system. We have all those pieces. The diatoms are relatively ungrazed, making that great carbon sink, meaning that there must be more krill than we think there should be, judging from the way things work the rest of the world around. So we think all these predators, the fish, the whale, and the birds are acting together to keep the system in balance and keep that carbon sink going. So what happens if you take a big chunk of the food web out, just like we did everywhere else on Earth? And of course, you expect that anything relies on that are going to decrease, but anything that was competing or that it was eating might increase. So we got into this pretty heavily for a while because we were really concerned about, okay, we have this beautiful laboratory that we've been working in, that a lot of scientists are working on, relying on as a pristine place, and now there's this new perturbation coming along. And we thought maybe, and we worked with a lot of people, this is about 45 different scientific teams working together in a unique collaboration. Usually scientists aren't, and traditionally haven't been so great about sharing data, but in this case, people were motivated to do so. And so we pulled together data from all these different teams that were studying different animals, different methods, over a period of about 40 years. And we pulled it all together and basically started asking questions. Where are the biological hotspots in the Ross Sea? What are the relationships between the animals and their environment, if there are any, and how can we ultimately use that information to design an effective marine protected area or reserve that we could try to protect from fishing. So we looked at all kinds of things, including what they all eat, which is basically the same stuff because there's not that much option, not many options. There's only the krill and the silverfish basically at the bottom of the food web, unless you can eat diatoms directly. We looked at how deep they forage, and we got some kind of surprises here as we were working with others who had data on, especially on killer whales. This is how deep we thought they dove, and then a new study came out and that more than doubled. That was pretty amazing. So they actually dive deep. A lot of species can't dive at all that are just picking stuff up off the surface. So there's basically a full range of what you can think of as niche occupation, but it's segregated by how deep they can dive and where they forage. And then we used machine learning algorithms on each species with all the covariates we could put into it. It's kind of like it's a machine learning approach. In this case, we used a program called MaxEnt, or maximum entropy modeling, to basically find a pattern of a relationship between the species prevalence, whether it was there or not, and all these different covariates. So in this case, we're looking at killer whales, those Ross Sea killer whales, and how common are they at different depths of water, and whether or not there's circumpolar deep water present, and chlorophyll presence, and distance to the shelf break, where the deep water starts, how much sea ice cover there was, and what the slope of the bottom was. And these models come together for each species and basically create a spatial representation of where the species is most likely to be found through time. So in this case, I have the killer whales in maximum occupation right around this line is where the continental shelf ends and the deep water begins. So they don't go out into the deep water very much. They like the shallower water, but right at the edge where there's a lot of upwelling. And that is known to be a very good place to forage. Weddell seals, similarly, but they're showing off this foraging hotspot on this place called the Pinnell Bank, where there's a little bit more kind of complexity, kind of like the Cordell Bank and the Gulf of the Farallones National Marine Sanctuary and the Cordell Marine Sanctuary are like that. They have that hotspot. Down here in the corner along the coastline, a lot of Weddell seals on that fast ice that you saw in the picture from the airplane as we came in. So we did this for all the species, basically every what you call air-breathing predator in the system. We did it for all of them, which is kind of an amazing thing to be able to do, and that's only because everyone was sharing their data. And we found all the patterns, and we put it into an artificial intelligence kind of situation, or a machine learning algorithm called zonation, which is the figure on the right. And zonation basically allows you to, it's an algorithm that looks not just at how many species are present in a given place, but also how important that place is for each individual species, given everywhere else that it occurs. So it takes those both into consideration at the same time, which is an improvement over species richness ranking, which is what this is on the left, just species richness. And if you look at just species richness, it does identify that one area, that Pinnell Bank area, as a hotspot. But when you look at it from the zonation perspective, it's finding places all over the place that are important, and that's because of that what's called irreplaceability of some of those pixels, some of those grid cells, from the perspective of some of the animals. Some of them, while they might be pretty common in one area, they're not common everywhere. While they might be present over a large area, they're really common only in one small spot, and you need to know about that when you're thinking about reserve design. So using all that, we actually were able to work with teams from New Zealand and the United States to put together a joint proposal to delineate the boundaries of the proposed marine protected area. And that actually got past the 24 countries that had to sign off on it. It took 7 years, but we did manage to get all 24 countries to sign. Anyone know that flag? The last ones to sign was Russia. China was second to last. Took a lot of work to convince them. We're still not sure why they finally agreed, but they did, so thankfully. They all had to, this is a consensus-based organization called the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR, and they're responsible for setting up marine protected areas and managing fisheries in the Southern Ocean. Everyone is worried about climate change in this context, and one of the goals of fisheries management globally is to set aside 10% at least of the world's oceans for protection by the year 2020. We are at 4% right now, so we have a lot of work to do in a hurry. There is a lot of work being done, and all around Antarctica there are new reserves planned. But the problem is you have to get 24 countries in this case to agree to them, which is very tough. But I'm hopeful that will actually come to pass. And obviously we want to be able to continue to use Antarctica as that natural laboratory that it's serving us so well. And so these protections are extremely important. As you saw, the rapid rate of change in the sea ice and the glaciers in particular. So with that, I will take your questions, but I want to acknowledge a lot of National Science Foundation support for all this work. The Lenfest Oceans program, which is part of the Pew Charitable Trust, and a lot of others have helped us get all this done. And we're working, this is our vision at Point Blue. It's pretty straightforward. Hope you can join in. So that because of our collaborative climate smart conservation actions today, thriving ecosystems, healthy ecosystems will sustain thriving wildlife and human communities for many decades to come. Thank you.